is U.S. history.
Hi everyone. This week we're going to go into World War II, what actually happens in the war, and looking at what happens specifically in the United States during World War II. But because it's a global thing, to talk about it this week, I've flown back to England, and this is Dover Castle, very near where I was raised. And the cool thing about Dover Castle is it has all of these different parts. So the castle itself has been there since the medieval period. There's a Roman lighthouse, and you can also go down underneath the cliffs into some tunnels. And it was from these tunnels during World War II that some of England's big decisions about war were made. Right? So there's the war rooms where they make decisions, and then there's the tunnels that they used as a hospital as well. But it's from inside these tunnels where they made decisions about war in England that your English teacher is going to teach you the US history of World War II. Anyway. So let's get started. A quick point here. Teaching you World War II in 2 weeks in this way is killing me because it is so interesting and so important. So this week you do have 2 optional assignments to choose from. I want you to really do one of those. However, I also have given you 2 extra credit options, and I'm going to continue to offer additional options through our class Instagram for you to learn more about World War II. In addition, I'm going to put together a website on World War II. Specifically, what I want to do is gather voices of different people talking about how they were raised to understand World War II, because I think that's so interesting how Germans were taught about World War II, how people in England are taught about it versus in the United States. Right? I'm going to have interviews with people who were in the war. And this is a project for me. If you would like to get involved in helping to interview veterans, in interviewing any of your relatives who were in World War II, but helping us put together a big collection of oral history of World War II, let me know. I would love to get involved and do this with you. Not only would I offer you a little bit of extra credit, but more importantly, maybe this is going to be a great experience and it would look really good on a college app or something like that. Okay, so let's get started. Do you remember we studied at the end of World War I, Germany was made to take blame for the war, and as punishment, they had to pay war reparations and give up their military, which was part of the reason that they and the rest of the world go into the Great Depression. Okay, so while we were learning about the Great Depression, right, so while we in the United States were making our clothes out of flour sacks and that kind of thing, in Germany, do you remember looking at this image of children playing with money because it was worth so little, right? And we said that Hitler comes in and he says, the German people, you're worth more than this, the war is not your fault, not all of your fault, it's the fault of Jewish people. So you have a right, talking especially to white Germans, to be proud, and I'm here for you. Let's rise to power again, right? So meanwhile, other countries in Europe, right, England included, are still struggling from the Great Depression and from World War I. So do you think they want to get involved in another war? No, they don't, right? Of course they don't. So Hitler is able to gain some power while other countries kind of hesitate to intervene, right? Then Hitler invades Poland, and then England and France tell him to stop. He says no. No. So in 1939, the UK and France declare war on Germany. Right? So you can imagine then England starts to get ready for war and places like this start to get set up. So we have the Allied powers, France, England. And then Hitler, he used to be kind of pals with the Soviet Union. They were going to work together, but he invades the Soviet Union. Don't invade the home of your friends, stupid. So the Soviet Union joins with England and France, and these are the Allied powers, okay? Meanwhile, you have Germany. Hitler wants to, let's face it, take over the world. We've got Italy with this guy Benito Mussolini who wants to take over. He invades Ethiopia. And then Japan, who also kind of wants to take over, well, really most of Asia, right? So the 3 of them, they've got a lot of big ambitions. So they work together. They come together. Those are the Axis powers, okay? So Japan, in order to take over Asia, they start by invading China. And at this point, the US is kind of intervening, right? The US doesn't want Japan invading China, but the Japanese get 80% of their oil from the US. So they say, we're gonna stop giving you some oil. Japan goes, fine, we'll go get our oil from elsewhere. So they try to go into Indochina. Because Japan wants oil, they want to invade Indochina. The only thing they're concerned about is the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. They are afraid that the American fleet in Pearl Harbor is the one thing that's going to stop them from getting more oil and from invading. So they go and bomb Pearl Harbor in 1941. And as you know, that doesn't go very well in the long run for them. Let's review. Here we go. The world is super poor. No one wants war. Except Hitler, who's like, I'm super strong. Let's have war. Mussolini, who's like, Italy, we're also strong. Let's have war. And Japan, who also thinks they can take over the world. Meanwhile, the US on the other side, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France make up the Allied powers. They're gonna fight each other. This war versus these three. If you would like more information on it, or you want to slow down and really understand the start of World War II, there's an extra credit assignment for that. Okay. However, today, I want to talk about hate. Specifically, the way that fear can increase hate for a group of people, and what we learned about that from World War II. So you know that Hitler is able to get power in part by uniting people against others, other countries, against Jewish people, against anyone he says is not part of the Aryan race. And it is amazing during time of war, people want someone to blame. And this desire, when fueled by fear, can have awful consequences. Right? So we know that Hitler did that with the Jews. We know that the Japanese told their people how awful Americans are. The Germans and Italians spoke about how awful Jewish people were and how awful the United States was. People spoke about how evil, people in the United States spoke about how evil Germans, Italians, and Japanese were. Okay? This hatred absolutely grew. So, did the people in the United States have some reason to fear Japanese attack? Yeah. Did the Japanese have a reason to think the American government was not their friend? Yeah. However, when this hatred of others becomes really strong, we see awful things happening, right? So there was fear that maybe came from some logical places, but went to the extreme. The exception to this is the hate against the Jewish people and the hate against anyone who's non-Aryan in Germany. There was no reason behind that. Right? Germany's dislike of the countries it was fighting, yeah, okay, I mean, you can see why he would promote it. But the hate against those people who were not Aryan, the people who were Jewish especially, no reason for that at all. The idea that they had been responsible for World War I was stupid, and yet the fueling of fear and hate led to the Holocaust. This anti-Semitism is really serious and has not left the world today. In fact, during the fear of coronavirus, signs like this have been included in protests against stay-at-home orders. So again, we're seeing fear lead to an increase of hate. In the United States, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, people turned on Japanese Americans. Fear, again, fueled hatred. Some concern over the Japanese coming into the country at that point may have made sense, right? So this is different in that the source of that fear might make sense to you, right? The Japanese have attacked. Yeah, maybe if more people from Japan are suddenly immigrating, people could be a bit more suspicious. Or if you see a Japanese plane flying overhead, you'd be nervous maybe in a way you weren't before. However, fear fueled hatred. Dr. Seuss, who we met last week, posted these images, turning the Japanese into a caricature, right? As the Germans did with Jewish people. Once you hate a group, you can then joke about them, turn them into a caricature. It's easier for people to think of them as less than human, and that hate gets worse. The Japanese Americans would never end up in gas chambers, but they were interned. Japanese and Japanese Americans alike, people who had been citizens for a long time, even, were rounded up, taken from their homes, and sent into camps. Along the west coast of the US, Japanese and Japanese Americans were given 4 days, anywhere between 4 days and 2 weeks, to gather their belongings and head for a camp. While Ronald Reagan apologized for Japanese internment in 1988,
we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.
The US government tried to justify their actions at the time with a widely circulated propaganda video.
The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all.
You can watch the video justifying Japanese internment and compare it to the individual experiences of Japanese Americans in optional assignment number 1. Later in the war, Japan was losing resources. The US had bombed a great number of Japanese cities, and the Soviet Union was also turning their attention to Japan. But the US had developed a new weapon of war. Even the scientists who created it were in awe of what they had produced in the atomic bomb. Some, including Albert Einstein, called on people not to use it. But in 1945, the US dropped 2 atomic bombs, one in Hiroshima and one in Nagasaki.
It took the bomb 43 seconds from the time we dropped it at 30,000 feet until the time it exploded at 18,000 feet. The first thing you saw was that large white cloud that was up well above our altitude. If you look down to the city of Hiroshima, it just looked like a pot of boiling oil covering the city.
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. If Japan does not surrender, bombs will have to be dropped on her war industries, and unfortunately, thousands of civilian lives will be lost.
Whether or not dropping the bomb was justified in warfare is your optional assignment number 2. What I can tell you now, however, is that the hatred that we had of Japanese Americans meant that when we dropped the bomb, the American reaction was one mostly of celebration. Though some Americans disagreed with this, including the propagandist now turned storyteller, Dr. Seuss. So Dr. Seuss visited Japan and saw the effects of the atomic bomb. And it was partly this that then led him to write some of the books we now know, where he talks a lot, especially in Horton Hears a Who, about the importance of treating all people like people.
A person's a person, no matter how small.
And in another one of his books, he looked into the hatred people have by looking at how people would judge others with just a star on their belly, as the Jewish people wore a star on their chest. So he tried to make a difference. Today, with the coronavirus going around, our president has consistently called the virus the Chinese virus.
There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China.
He says that this is totally fair, as do many Americans, right? It's fair to call it the Chinese virus because it originated in the Wuhan province of China. However, others say that this is dangerously close to starting the kind of hate that we see in World War II, right? The idea that maybe it was fair to say that, the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, they absolutely did, and maybe some fear was justified, but we took it too far, right? And that maybe now we're taking some of the hatred towards Chinese Americans too far. Anti-Chinese feeling is on the rise in the US today, as is anti-Semitism. Fear will fuel hatred if left unchecked and can have disastrous consequences. You have an additional extra credit assignment to look at the rising hatred in our country at the moment. World War II was a devastating war. And while in the United States, we claim that we won the war and we think of ourselves as victorious, and while that's true in many ways, we also need to remember the lessons that we need to learn from this conflict and to analyze the choices that our government made. It's also important to learn about what happened for the rest of the world in World War II. The Japanese Americans, how the Soviet Union also was a huge part and sacrificed more than really any other country in helping us to win the war. Okay? You'll go more into that in world history next year for your 9th graders, or last year if you're an 11th grader. Okay? There's a lot to learn. So there are more optional assignments, there are more extra credit assignments. But again, this week your optional assignments are: number 1, was the US justified in dropping the atomic bombs? Number 2, how did the US justify Japanese internment? You can choose one of those. But then there are extra credit assignments, and there will be more coming from me on World War II, because I love it. If you don't have the time to study it right now, that's okay. But if you like history and you would like to help me either producing that series of oral history, so talking to people who were alive in World War II, please contact me. Or if you just want to kind of read what we come up with together on that website, I'll let you know about it next week. Okay? All right. I hope you're all well, thinking of you always. You're good enough, you're smart enough, and I've got your back.
Some people feared Adolf Hitler. Others mocked him. The Disney staff came up with the idea for a cartoon to be titled Donald Duck in Nazi-Land, giving the all-American duck a nightmare that he was living in a country run by Nazis. The title changed when a song written for the cartoon by Oliver Wallace became a runaway hit and a now classic recording by Spike Jones. It then became essential to change the name of the cartoon to De Fuhrer's Face. It's easy to see why the film was so popular. It's very, very funny, reducing the serious tenets of Hitler's Nazism to slapstick absurdities. And it gave audiences a chance to think, as Donald does, about the freedoms they might have taken for granted.
Am I glad to be a citizen of the United States of America?